Battle of Kolubara, Serbia's defiance against the odds.
In the chill of November 1914, the valleys of western Serbia echoed with the thunder of artillery. The mountains were bare, the rivers swollen with winter rain, and the roads little more than mud tracks churned by wagons and hooves. Along those miserable routes, tens of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers advanced into Serbia, convinced that victory was only days away. Their empire had promised revenge. What they found instead was a nation too small to matter on a map, but too proud to yield. It had begun months earlier, with the shots fired in Sarajevo. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand fell to the bullet of a Serbian nationalist, Austria-Hungary seized the moment to crush what it saw as a troublesome neighbor. On July 28, 1914, the empire declared war on Serbia, confident that the tiny Balkan kingdom could be destroyed in weeks. Vienna's newspapers predicted an easy campaign, a punitive expedition to teach Serbia obedience. But they did not understand the ground, the people, or the will that waited for them beyond the Danube. Serbia was poor, exhausted, and still recovering from two Balkan wars fought in the years before 1914. Its army was small, barely 250,000 men at the outbreak of war, and badly equipped. Many soldiers fought in worn uniforms from earlier campaigns. Rifles and boots were scarce, and artillery ammunition dangerously limited. Yet the spirit of the Serbian soldier, the vojnik, was something the empire could not measure in statistics. These were men who had fought the Turks, the Bulgarians, and each other for generations. They knew every ridge and ravine of their homeland. They were farmers, shepherds, and peasants turned warriors, defending not territory, but survival itself. The Austro-Hungarian plan was simple: a two-pronged invasion across the rivers Sava and Drina, followed by a drive toward Belgrade. General Oskar Potiorek, governor of Bosnia and commander of the 5th and 6th armies, was determined to redeem his reputation. He had been in Sarajevo the day the Archduke was assassinated, and the failure to prevent it had humiliated him. Now he meant to wipe away that disgrace by crushing Serbia personally. The first invasion came in August 1914. It ended in disaster. Serbian forces, under the calm, unassuming command of General Radomir Putnik and his field commander Stepa Stepanovic, fought fiercely at Ser Mountain. In a battle fought in fog and rain, the Serbs inflicted a shocking defeat on Potiorek's troops, the first Allied victory of the Great War. The Austrians retreated in confusion back across the Drina, leaving thousands of dead and prisoners behind. Vienna was stunned, Berlin was embarrassed, but Potiorek, humiliated yet again, refused to accept defeat. He regrouped, reinforced, and planned a new offensive, one that would crush Serbia once and for all. By late autumn, the empire returned with overwhelming strength. 3 armies, numbering nearly 450,000 men, surged towards central Serbia. Against them stood barely half as many Serbs, already short of ammunition and food. The new Austrian attack began in November along the Kolubara River, west of Belgrade. The river cut through a region of low mountains and ridges, difficult terrain for both sides, but the only route toward the capital. From the start, the weather was merciless. Freezing rain turned roads into quagmires, flooding the lowlands and sweeping away bridges. Soldiers marched knee-deep in mud, dragging cannons by hand when horses collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian army, though better equipped, was unprepared for the conditions. Yet their sheer numbers pushed the exhausted Serbs back, mile by mile. By November 16th, the Austrians captured Valjevo, a key town on the route to Belgrade. Potiorek declared the war won. Messages to Vienna spoke of total victory, and newspapers once again printed celebratory headlines. But in the Serbian headquarters at Gornji Milanovac, the situation was desperate. Ammunition stocks were down to a handful of shells per gun. The soldiers, many barefoot, fought in soaked rags. Typhus spread through the ranks. Even so, Putnik refused to surrender. Old, sick, and confined to a chair, he directed the defense with quiet precision, shuffling maps and issuing calm orders while chaos surrounded him. His subordinate, The fiery Stepa Stepanovic commanded the First Army on the Kolubara line and held off attacks for weeks, retreating only when absolutely necessary. As the Austro-Hungarians pressed forward, Belgrade trembled. The capital had already suffered from shelling during the first invasion, and now it faced the prospect of occupation. On December 1st, 1914, Austrian troops entered the city. Emperor Franz Joseph's forces could finally claim they had avenged Sarajevo. Bells rang in Vienna, but the triumph was premature. Behind the scenes, Putnik and Stepanovic were planning something extraordinary. Rather than fight to annihilation, the Serbian army withdrew deeper into the interior, feigning collapse. The Austrians, convinced that the enemy was finished, stretched their lines dangerously thin as they advanced into the hills. Then, as the weather cleared and fresh supplies arrived from the Allies, most crucially artillery shells from France and Greece, Putnik ordered a full counterattack. At dawn on December 3rd, the Serbian army struck back along the Kolubara River. It was sudden, ferocious, and completely unexpected. Trumpets sounded through the mist as Serbian troops charged with bayonets fixed, shouting, "Za kralja I otačbinu," for the king and the fatherland. The Austro-Hungarians, complacent after days of unopposed advance, reeled under the assault. Many units broke in confusion. Serbian mountain artillery, once silent for lack of shells, now thundered from the ridges, catching enemy columns in deadly crossfire. Stepanovic's troops advanced like ghosts through fog and mud, retaking positions they had lost weeks earlier. The riverbanks became killing grounds as Austrians tried to hold crossings under relentless fire. By December 6th, the counteroffensive was in full motion, and the momentum had shifted entirely. Serbian cavalry rode through the enemy rear, cutting lines of communication and capturing supplies. Soldiers who had been starving days before now seized food, weapons, and ammunition from the retreating invaders. Within a week, the grand Austrian invasion had unraveled completely. Potiorek, stunned by the sudden collapse, ordered a retreat, but it was too late to make it orderly. Roads were jammed with broken wagons and panicked men. The same mud that had slowed their advance now swallowed their retreat. Pursued relentlessly, the Austrians abandoned artillery and stores in their flight back toward the Drina. On December 15th, the Serbian army re-entered Belgrade. The city's streets were lined with civilians waving flags and weeping as the exhausted soldiers marched through. The capital had changed hands twice in 2 weeks, but now it was free. Church bells rang across the frozen river, this time for Serbia. The empire that had sworn to destroy a nation found itself humiliated once more by the same foe it had mocked. The Battle of Kolubara was over, and Serbia had achieved the impossible. The Serbian counterattack along the Kolubara River was not just a military maneuver, it was an act of collective defiance. What began as a desperate stand transformed into one of the most astonishing reversals of the First World War. When General Putnik gave the order to advance, his troops were starving, exhausted, and outnumbered. Yet in the hearts of the men who picked up their rifles that icy December morning, something burned hotter than hunger. Rage. Rage for the humiliation of occupation, for the villages trampled by foreign boots, for the graves of families buried under shellfire. The turnaround was as swift as it was brutal. As Serbian divisions swept north, the Austro-Hungarian troops, overconfident after their capture of Belgrade, found themselves utterly unprepared. The empire's armies, drawn from a patchwork of nationalities, Czechs, Croats, Hungarians, Poles, were plagued by poor coordination and collapsing morale. Orders arrived late or contradicted one another. Entire regiments spoke different languages. When Serbian forces suddenly surged from the hills, bayonets glinting in the frost, confusion spread like fire through the ranks. The weather, once the Austrians' ally, now turned against them. Snow and sleet lashed the valleys, and freezing winds howled down from the mountains. The Kolubara plain became a wasteland of mud, churned by boots and hooves. Horses sank to their bellies, carts overturned, rifles jammed with ice. In the chaos, Serbian infantry moved like ghosts through the storm, slipping across frozen streams and ambushing isolated detachments. The enemy's columns, stretched thin along roads that no longer existed, crumbled under the relentless assault. General Stepa Stepanović led from the front. Short, thick-set and tireless, he was often seen standing waist-deep in mud, shouting orders to artillery crews or sharing bread with his men. His soldiers adored him. His calm defiance gave them courage. When one officer suggested halting to rest, Stepanović famously replied, "We rest when we are free." His First Army drove a spearhead straight through the Austrian center, forcing the invaders to abandon their supply lines and retreat in disorder. In the south, General Živojin Mišić commanded the Serbian Second Army with equal brilliance. A veteran of the Balkan Wars, Mišić understood the terrain better than any Austrian general could hope to. He maneuvered his troops through narrow passes and across icy rivers to strike at the enemy's flanks, collapsing their defenses one by one. By December 8th, his soldiers had recaptured Valjevo, the town whose fall had seemed to mark Serbia's doom only weeks earlier. As the counteroffensive gathered momentum, the Austro-Hungarian command began to disintegrate. General Potiorek, watching his armies unravel, issued contradictory orders: retreat one day, hold the next. His officers no longer trusted him. On the front lines, panic spread. Soldiers discarded weapons and fled into the forests, pursued by the relentless Serbian advance. Those who managed to reach the Drina found the bridges already jammed with wagons and men, scenes of chaos illuminated by the flames of burning supply trains. In Vienna, the news was a catastrophe. Newspapers that had proclaimed the fall of Belgrade now had to explain the unthinkable. The Empire's armies were retreating once again, driven out by a country barely the size of Scotland. The humiliation was total. The Austro-Hungarian General Staff tried to suppress the scale of the disaster, but the truth leaked out through soldiers' letters and foreign correspondence. The phrase Kolubara became synonymous with shame. For the Serbs, the victory was more than military. It was existential. Every regained village was both battlefield and graveyard. The soldiers often found their families dead or missing, their homes reduced to ash. Many fought on without shoes, wrapping their feet in rags torn from enemy uniforms. Ammunition was scavenged from Austrian dead. Captured guns were turned against their former owners. In some sectors, battles devolved into hand-to-hand combat fought in knee-deep snow. Yet the Serbs pressed forward, driven by a will the invaders could not comprehend. By mid-December, the entire Austro-Hungarian front had collapsed. The retreat became a rout. Over 220,000 men, nearly half of Potiorek's invading force, were killed, wounded, or captured. The Serbs, though victorious, suffered grievously themselves. Over 130,000 casualties in a nation of barely 4 million. Every village mourned. Every family had someone missing. But they had done what no one thought possible. They had thrown back one of Europe's great empires with almost nothing but grit and terrain on their side. On December 15th, Serbian forces re-entered Belgrade. The capital was in ruins, streets cratered by shells, bridges shattered, houses burned. But the people came out in thousands to greet their soldiers, waving torn flags, offering bread and salt, and singing the old war songs. Many wept openly, embracing soldiers whose uniforms hung in rags. Even King Peter, old and frail, rode into the city on horseback, his white beard streaked with dust. When he raised his hand in salute, the crowd erupted into cheers that carried across the river to the empty Austrian trenches beyond. For General Putnik, confined to his chair in a farmhouse headquarters, the news of victory came quietly. He looked over the telegrams and said only, "So, the river kept its word." The Kolubara, which had seemed a line of defeat weeks earlier, had become the symbol of resistance. Serbia had not merely survived, it had humiliated the might of an empire. But victory came at a cost too heavy to measure. Disease spread through the ranks, typhus, dysentery, influenza. The same soldiers who had fought for their nation now lay dying in hospitals without medicine or heat. The war had turned the land into a graveyard, and the coming winter promised no mercy. Still, for a brief, shining moment, Serbia stood proud. Against every prediction, against every statistic, it had done what no one else in Europe had yet managed. It had defeated a central power on the field of battle. Twice. In London and Paris, generals studied the campaign in astonishment. How had a peasant army without resources accomplished what million-man armies in France could not? The answer was simple. The Serbs had fought not for empire, not for glory, but for existence. And though the empire would return the following year with vengeance and reinforcements, nothing could erase the memory of that winter when the world's smallest army stopped one of the largest in its tracks. When the snow settled over the valleys of Kolubara, it covered more than the dead. Beneath the white silence lay the cost of Serbia's triumph. The villages that had once stood along the front were now little more than heaps of ash and splintered timber. The rivers were clogged with wreckage and corpses, the bridges gone, the fields littered with twisted rifles and frozen horses. The smell of decay lingered even in the cold, drifting down the mountain slopes where men had fallen by the thousands. Victory, the Serbs soon realized, had brought no peace, only survival. The army that re-entered Belgrade in December 1914 was a shadow of the one that had marched out in July. Of its roughly 250,000 men, nearly half were dead, wounded, or too sick to fight. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and plagued by disease. Their boots were gone, their uniforms in tatters. And yet, as they limped through the ruined streets, civilians greeted them as heroes. The people of Belgrade embraced soldiers who had lost brothers, fathers, and sons, weeping openly in gratitude and grief. But behind the cheering, the true scale of the disaster began to reveal itself. Serbia's tiny infrastructure was shattered. Railways were destroyed, food stores burned, livestock slaughtered. The Austro-Hungarian occupation, brief though it had been, left famine and ruin in its wake. Entire towns had been emptied of civilians. Fields that had fed the army were trampled into mud. Winter was closing in, and the country had nothing left to give. The Serbian government, still led by Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, faced the impossible task of feeding both civilians and an army that had consumed every last resource. Allied promises of aid trickled slowly through the mountains. French and British shipments were delayed, and what little arrived often came too late. Soldiers were ordered to remain in defensive positions along the frontier, but they could barely stand. Then came the epidemic. Typhus, carried by lice and worsened by starvation, spread like wildfire through Serbia in early 1915. What the Austrians had failed to do with artillery, disease accomplished with silent efficiency. Hospitals overflowed, and doctors collapsed beside their patients. In Valjevo, one of the towns hardest hit, nearly every building was converted into a hospital. Nurses died by the hundreds. Priests performed last rites until they too fell ill. Within months, over 100,000 Serbs, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. The victory of Kolubara had saved the nation from conquest, but not from catastrophe. Even so, morale remained astonishingly high. The people had endured centuries of struggle. They understood that survival itself was victory. Soldiers who recovered returned to their posts, guarding the borders against the next inevitable invasion. King Peter visited the front lines wrapped in a wool cloak, shaking hands with the men and telling them, "You have done what no army in Europe has done. You have defended freedom against an empire." The old monarch's frail presence reminded the soldiers why they fought. They were defending their homes, not for conquest, but for the right to exist. In Vienna, humiliation turned to rage. Emperor Franz Joseph demanded explanations, and the general staff turned on Potiorek. Once hailed as a national hero, he now became the scapegoat for the empire's second failure in Serbia. He was dismissed in disgrace, his career finished. Yet few in the Austro-Hungarian command admitted the deeper truth, that the war against Serbia was unwinnable. Geography, weather, and morale had all conspired against them. And unlike other battlefronts, Serbia was not a battlefield of strategy. It was a crucible of endurance. Foreign observers began to take notice. French and British officers who arrived to assess the situation were astonished by what they saw. They found an army barely held together by willpower, yet radiating an unbreakable spirit. A French officer wrote home, "They have no bread, no bullets, no rest, and yet they smile. I have seen courage in battle before, but never courage like this." Still, the cost was undeniable. Every Serbian family had suffered loss. The nation's universities closed, its factories silent. The countryside was filled with widows and orphans. Even as snow covered the graves of Kolubara, the next invasion was already being planned. The Central Powers would not forgive the humiliation. The Kolubara campaign had also revealed something far more dangerous: the limitations of Allied aid. France and Britain, bogged down in the trenches of the Western Front, could offer only symbolic support to Serbia. Ammunition and supplies came by sea to the Greek port of Salonika, and then overland through Albania, an impossible route through mountains and winter storms. Each shell that reached the Kolubara line had already cost lives in transport. By the spring of 1915, Serbia stood at a crossroads. The nation had proven its courage, but was slowly bleeding to death from exhaustion and disease. General Putnik, his health failing, continued to command from his chair, issuing orders with quiet resolve. Generals Stepanovic and Misic rebuilt what remained of their armies, aware that another invasion would come sooner or later. And it did. Later that year, the empire would return, this time with German support and overwhelming force. But in those brief months between campaigns, Serbia lived in a fragile state of triumph, proud, yet haunted. The bells of Belgrade rang daily to remind its people that they had achieved the impossible, even as hunger gnawed at their stomachs and disease thinned their ranks. The victory at Kolubara was the kind of triumph that changes nothing and everything. It did not end the war, but it proved that courage could defy the laws of numbers. It did not bring peace, but it showed that a small nation could stand upright in the face of extinction. Serbia had won its greatest battle, and in doing so, had exhausted the very strength it needed to survive what was still to come. By the summer of 1915, the fragile calm in Serbia had begun to fracture. The nation that had triumphed so miraculously at Kolubara was starving, sick, and surrounded. The fields that once fed its people lay untended, and the army that had defied an empire was now little more than a weary skeleton of its former self. Ammunition was scarce again, medicine non-existent, and disease still haunted the villages and barracks. The Serbs had driven the invaders out, but they had done so at the cost of their future strength. Across the borders, the enemy gathered. In Vienna and Berlin, the defeat of 1914 had been an intolerable humiliation, and plans for revenge were already underway. This time, Austria-Hungary would not attack alone. The German Empire, determined to eliminate the Balkan front and secure its link to the Ottoman ally, prepared to join the new offensive. Bulgaria, Serbia's old rival, saw an opportunity to reclaim lost territory and avenge its defeat in the Balkan Wars. By autumn, the encirclement was complete. The Serbs watched the storm build with grim resignation. General Putnik, now nearly crippled by illness, saw the reports from his scouts and understood what was coming. "We shall be outnumbered 4-1, he told his staff quietly, "but we shall fight as long as we can stand." The government in Niš appealed desperately to the Allies for help, but the Western powers were too deeply mired in their own fronts. Only token promises came. Some supplies through Salonika, a few advisors, vague assurances of future aid. The Serbs would face the onslaught alone. The attack began in October 1915. German and Austro-Hungarian divisions struck from the north and west, while Bulgarian troops invaded from the east. It was a perfect trap. Serbia, already hollowed out by famine and disease, could not hold all fronts at once. Artillery rained down on the Kolubara Valley once more, this time far heavier than before. Villages that had been rebuilt after the previous year's battles were obliterated again. The Serbian lines bent, then broke. The retreat was inevitable, but not disorderly. Under General Živojin Misic, the army withdrew in stages, fighting delaying actions that bled the enemy wherever possible. Soldiers who had fought barefoot the year before now marched in snow without coats. Civilians fled alongside them, families dragging carts, priests carrying church icons, entire villages abandoning their homes to the advancing enemy. The roads clogged with humanity moving south, driven by fear and hunger. King Peter, now 70 years old and too frail to walk unaided, refused to abandon his people. Wrapped in a soldier's greatcoat, he rode on horseback beside his army, his beard frozen with frost. At his side marched Crown Prince Alexander, determined to share the same hardships. To the soldiers, their presence mattered more than any reinforcement could have. "If the king can endure this," one officer wrote, "then we have no right to fall." As the Serbs retreated south through the mountains, their situation grew desperate. The Allies in Greece urged them to hold out until a relief force could be organized, but no such army ever came. Bulgaria's advance from the east cut off the last railway to Salonika, and by November, Serbia was completely isolated. The only escape route left was through Albania, over the Prokletie Mountains, aptly named the Accursed. It was a land of rock, snow, and silence, and beyond it lay the Adriatic Sea and survival. The decision to retreat into Albania was both desperate and historic. On November 25, 1915, the Serbian government, royal family, and entire army, nearly 250,000 people, began the march westward. It was not an orderly military maneuver. It was an exodus. Soldiers, civilians, and children trudged together through snowstorms, crossing mountains without food or shelter. Horses died by the thousands. Wagons were abandoned. Wounded men were left behind in the drifts. Many froze to death in their sleep. Others were killed by Albanian tribesmen seeking revenge for old feuds. Every step westward was a battle against nature itself. Witnesses described scenes of biblical suffering. Columns stretched for miles along icy ridges. Mothers carried children until they collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers shared the last of their rations with orphans who followed them silently. The sound of avalanches mingled with prayers, curses, and the crack of rifles as rear guards fought off pursuing enemy patrols. "We no longer knew who was alive or dead," one survivor wrote. "We marched only because to stop was to die." When they finally reached the Adriatic coast in January 1916, the survivors were skeletal. Of the 250,000 who had set out, less than half made it. The rest were scattered across the mountains, lost to hunger, frost, or disease. Those who reached the sea found salvation in the form of Allied ships waiting to evacuate them to Corfu. The island became both refuge and graveyard. Thousands of soldiers, too weak to recover, died on its beaches and were buried in mass graves beneath the olive trees. Yet even in that desolation, Serbia refused to die. On Corfu, the remnants of its army reorganized under Allied supervision. Young recruits arrived from abroad, and soldiers who had survived Kolubara found themselves once again drilling in the island's bitter wind. They had lost their homes, their families, their country, but not their identity. General Misic, now commanding the reconstituted army, told his men, "We shall return. The road is long, but it ends at home." For the Allies, the Serbian retreat became a symbol of endurance. French newspapers called it La Grande Retraite Serbe, the Great Serbian Retreat, a phrase spoken with both pity and admiration. In Britain, where few had even known where Serbia was a year earlier, the story of the march through Albania stirred public sympathy. Donations poured in, medical teams volunteered, songs were written about the little nation that would not die. But for the Serbs themselves, no words could capture what had been lost. Their homeland was occupied, their cities in ruins, their dead unburied beneath the snow. The victory of Kolubara had become a memory, one glorious spark before the darkness. Still, in the ashes of exile, the Serbian spirit endured. On the shores of Corfu, the soldiers would gather at night to sing the same songs they had sung on the Kolubara River. Their voices, hoarse but steady, rose against the sea wind, a promise that the struggle was not over. They had beaten the empire once. One day, they vowed, they would return and do it again. Years later, when the guns fell silent and new borders carved the Balkans into uneasy peace, the Kolubara River still flowed through the valleys of western Serbia. Quiet, indifferent, eternal. To outsiders, it was just another river winding through hills scarred by forgotten wars. But to the Serbs, it was sacred ground. Its waters had carried the echoes of their defiance, the blood of their sons, and the memory of the winter when a nation refused to die. Those who survived the Great Retreat never forgot where their journey began. When they spoke of the war, they did not start with defeat or exile. They began with Kolubara. It was the battle that proved that courage, even when starving and barefoot, could defy the weight of an empire. It was where peasants in worn coats had stared down cannons and driven them back with nothing but resolve. To the world, it was a minor front. To Serbia, it was its soul. General Putnik never lived to see the end of the war. He died in exile in 1917, his heart failing long before his army ever returned home. Misic and Stepanovic, however, survived to lead their soldiers again. In 1918, after years of rebuilding, the Serbian Army, reborn and fighting as part of the Allied forces on the Salonika front, marched north once more. In autumn, they swept through Macedonia, liberated their homeland, and by November re-entered Belgrade, the same city they had fought for at Kolubara. This time, the empire that had sworn to destroy them no longer existed. But victory could not erase what had been lost. Serbia emerged from the Great War victorious, but shattered. 1 in 4 of its people were dead. Entire villages had vanished from maps. The country had fought not for conquest, but for the right to exist, and though it survived, it had been bled white. The heroes of Kolubara returned to a homeland of widows and graves. Still, in every classroom and barracks, the story of that battle was told. Children learned how the army, starving and surrounded, had turned and fought back. Veterans told it quietly, as both pride and warning. Kolubara became a symbol, not of triumph, but of what defiance costs. In its lessons lay the paradox of every small nation caught between empires, that victory can be as cruel as defeat, and endurance the only true glory. The river itself remains serene. In spring, when it floods, it carries silt from the mountains, grains of the soil that once soaked up the blood of 1914. Locals say that when the wind moves just right across its surface, you can still hear something faint, a bugle, a command, the tramp of boots half swallowed by time. Perhaps it is only the wind, or perhaps it is the echo of that December when a dying country chose to rise instead. The Kolubara still runs, winding between hills that have outlived empires, whispering its quiet testament to history, that courage is not measured by victory, but by refusal to surrender.